Welcome, everyone. There are some old friends and many new friends here. Welcome, everyone, to what will be a really, I think, enriching and engaging and provocative couple of days. This broad workshop through the eyes of young children, reporting on children, and the international refugee crisis. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Bruce Shapiro. I'm the executive director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of this school and is sponsoring this workshop. I'll say a few things about that in a minute. Before I begin, I just want to very quickly acknowledge the foundations for very special organizations that have made this workshop possible, that have brought all of you here and made it possible to bring the top experts in the world to speak with you. They'll talk a little more later, but I'm just going to give you all their names for starters. They're up there on the screen. The Bernard van Leer Foundation of the Netherlands, the Jacobs Foundation based in Switzerland, the Maria Cecilia Soto Vidal Foundation from Brazil, and the Two Lilies Fund from Colorado here in the U.S. All of these organizations are not just funders, but truly partners. They are all leaders in research and dissemination and policy of evidence-based information on early childhood development and early childhood resilience and both the specific issues around refugees and migrants and the broader issues around the first years of life. You'll be hearing more from them over the course of the weekend, but thank you all. Also wanted to say that along with those of you with the journalists in the room, there are a few folks who are important colleagues who will be here throughout the week as not only as faculty members speaking at distinct moments, but as resource folks for all of you. And again, I'm going to point them out now. They'll have more to say later, but Karen Brown of New England Public Radio, who is a science and health policy journalist, a great radio journalist, and has been part of a whole series of programs we have done on early childhood development. Khaled Nasser in the back of the room, who is a psychologist based in Beirut with a profound knowledge of trauma and resilience issues and has a lot to say both about kids, refugees, but also has done a lot of work with us as journalists to be supportive. He and I will be talking together about that. Also not here, but will be joining us in a few minutes, Donna de Cesare, who is an extraordinary photojournalist, a past Dart Center fellow and professor at the University of Texas in Austin, who will be here talking about, in particular, issues around visual representation and visual storytelling and other things. We're here at a sort of extraordinary moment when the question of refugees and migrants is to a very large extent driving politics and policy and public debate all over the world. There are sweeping tides of displacement and upheaval, environmental crisis, conflict, economic displacement, all of the root causes that all of you know so well. In the middle of this crisis, though, there are the most vulnerable people of all, the youngest children. And as journalists, all of you who are here because you cover these issues know instinctively that telling stories about these extraordinarily vulnerable children is a big part of the job. All of you know instinctively, I think, that we're talking not just about the treatment of children in the moment of family separation or the lives of families in the moment of upheaval or the months on the road, but the long-term consequences of these traumatic events over the lives of children and the lives of their communities. And you also know, all of you are here, because you know that there is or ought to be or must be something to guide us about effective policy, effective ways to help, effective interventions in the lives of people who've been disrupted, who are living in refugee camps, who are in new cities, new countries, new languages. How do we even begin to think about that? That's, this is a scientific challenge. What is the baseline knowledge that we should have in our toolkits about how the youngest human beings are affected by upheaval and what kinds of interventions and what kinds of measures of intervention are important to know about? How do we hold institutions and countries and leaders accountable for doing what can be done? We also know it's a craft challenge. Telling the stories of the very young children stretches our toolkit to its limit. How do we interview? How do we photograph? How do we gain the trust of families? How do we overlay science and policy and the human? How do we tell effective stories that engage readers without sensationalizing, that attract viewers without simply arousing, but instead encouraging people to think, and that keep news consumers engaged rather than feeling exhausted and turning away? All of us have struggled with this. And we're here over the next couple of days to begin a conversation, to wrestle with both the knowledge gap and the craft gap that all of you and all of us as journalists feel when confronted with an issue of this scope. We are here to talk about early childhood as it intersects with refugees and migration as a subject, and we're here to talk about it as a craft challenge and as an early childhood as a lens through which to look at the whole refugee crisis. I should tell you a little bit about the Dart Center, about this workshop and where it came from, about what's going to happen in the next couple of days. And then we're going to do a little sort of exercise where we all get to know each other a little bit. Let me do quick housekeeping, though, before I do that. First of all, perhaps most important, restrooms. There is a women's toilet on the left, immediately outside of this door. There is a unisex bathroom halfway down the hall, also on the left, and a men's room all the way downstairs in the basement, 2 flights down, if the one stall in the unisex restroom is not occupied. I should say that Columbia University has a very clear policy of gender identification. However you self-identify, that's the restroom to use. We have a hashtag, DartECD. I've written it on the board back there, but if you are going to be tweeting at all, that's what to use. Ariel, my colleague, has already set up a Facebook group for all of you in this workshop. Ariel Richard is the social media guru and general dog's body of this, who's helped put a lot of this together. You'll get to know the staff in a minute. We'll introduce those folks. After the workshop, we'll invite everyone to, in addition, a larger Facebook group that includes journalists who've been in similar programs on early childhood that the Dart Center has done before. It's also important to say that once we get through this workshop, thanks to our funders, we're also going to be able to offer small what we are calling micro-fellowships, essentially project grants to a certain number of you to help support stories at the intersection of early childhood and refugees and migration that you couldn't otherwise do. We'll talk more about that toward the end of the workshop, but just, be thinking in the back of your mind, is there a story I'd really like to do that couldn't otherwise get done? And we may talk about that at some point. Briefly about the DART Center. First of all, DART is the family name of our funder. It doesn't stand for anything. We're in the second generation of DART family funders now. We are supported in our core funding by the Kenneth B. Dart Foundation. The Dart family are the folks who invented the styrofoam coffee cup. If you see Dart on the bottom of coffee cups, that's us. That's how you're here. So drink lots of coffee. The DART Center started out with the basic mission of preparing journalists to cover the aftermath of traumatic events. And that sounds simple. Okay, crime, war, gender violence, human rights, and everything in between. As time has gone on, it's clear that the edges of that mission have stretched out. And when you're looking, for example, at the first years of life, which in an earlier generation we might have thought of as, well, maybe it's the family beat or the education beat. That involves fundamental issues of human resilience and vulnerability and what happens to children in the face of adverse experience, which all of us as reporters need in our toolkit. So starting several years ago, thanks to the foundations in this room, we began a series of programs looking at reporting through the early childhood lens, both sort of general workshops on covering early childhood development, and more recently, beginning in January with a regional workshop in Amman, Jordan, and now with this one, with this particular focus on refugees and migration, which are too big to be called a single crisis, but are a central phenomenon of our time. We believe strongly at the DART Center of combining the very best evidence-based science and bringing the people who are doing the leading groundbreaking research in this area to us to help both give us some literacy in these fields, to help us assess what we encounter and report on, but also at the same time to combine that with journalist-to-journalist conversation. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we combine it with our ethical questions, our interviewing challenges, our craft skills? We also will talk a little bit about how we ourselves as journalists can stay resilient when covering these challenging stories. That will be on the program a little bit later. Our goal here today is to make you all part of this, I think, emerging global network, global cohort of journalists who have the knowledge and skill to focus effectively on the vulnerability and resilience of the youngest children, to think about where the lives of young children fit into the broader social contract, and in particular, to be thinking in this case about migrants and refugees and what kinds of coverage choices we should be making. What are the great stories that no one else is telling? How do we capture public imagination? That's why we're here. We're here to be good journalists. I was saying to one of our colleagues from one of our foundations earlier this morning that a friend of mine, an old Vietnam War correspondent, kind of gruffly defines journalism as finding stuff out and telling people about it. And that is what all of you in here do. You find stuff out and tell people about it. But when it comes to issues as fraught and overwhelming and consequential and complex as children and their caregivers who are caught up in migration and refugee crises, what do we find out? Where should we be looking? What are the standards by which policies can be judged? How do we tell people about it? What do we tell them? Those are the questions that we're all challenged by and need to answer. It's a matter of journalistic innovation. No generation has ever confronted refugees on this global scale before, no generation of civil society, but no generation of journalists either. So you all in this room have been called to be innovators, and this week is here to facilitate that.